Chapter 1. The summer sun beat down on his sandy head. He could see the clouds forcing their way across the sky, and smiled ruefully, pondering how and why he was there. It was all because of a woman. Wasn't everything because of a woman? At that moment he cursed having ever seen Elizabeth Marie Dalton, cursed having seen her sitting on top of her jet-black mare, with her sharp hazel eyes, her bewitching figure, and her wild red hair whipping in the wind. The very memory twanged his stomach painfully. Aggravated, he pulled on the ropes cruelly binding his wrists to a large, pretentious white oak. He'd wondered about the probability of an oak tree growing in the middle of the great sandy desert, but was now long past caring. The turkey vultures had stopped circling now. Some sat on the tree branches, some at his feet, waiting for him to weaken. He should have weakened by now, as 3 days had passed. He was naked, save the underwear they permitted him to keep on. The rest of his body was horribly sunburnt. He addressed the vultures. "Well, fellows, at least your meal will be well done." He looked up, and there she was, sitting on that pristine mare, which she aptly called Velvet, and laughing at his comment. Shaking his head, he chuckled to himself. "You're back, are you? I wish you'd quit haunting me." He'd seen her several times since they'd lashed him to that darned old oak. "Have I been haunting you, Pax?" You're talking back. I'm even more delirious than I thought." She laughed a laugh which drove him even closer to the point of insanity than the sun did. At one point in his past he'd loved hearing it. "It is the sun, perhaps. You seem to have had enough of it. The sun, I mean." He muttered a half-intelligible yes. She dismounted, and the spurs on her boots clanged when she landed. She snaked one finger down his muscular chest, causing his burn to sting. "I almost regret having to take you down. You look so delicious tied to that tree." "Then don't. I'd rather die than owe my life to you." "Really?" she smirked. "Then prepare for disappointment. I'd hate to have your death on my conscience." She removed a worn leather flask from her saddlebag. "Now, I know if I take you off that tree, you're going to try to strangle me, so I think I shall tend to you first. I hope you don't mind." Pouring some water in her hand, she smoothed it across his forehead, then spread the water over his dry, cracked lips. "I'm not hallucinating. You are real. What are you doing here?" he asked, as she rubbed some cooling ointment over his chest. "Why do you think I'm here?" Having always despised it when someone answered a question with another question, he growled, "You really love annoying me, don't you?" "It's my favorite pastime," she smiled, placing the flask against his lips and pouring water into his mouth. He coughed when the liquid hit his throat, but as he grew accustomed to it, he gulped thirstily. She removed the flask after he'd had a meager portion. "You shouldn't have too much all at once." "Thank you," he said, truly appreciating the Adams ale. Studying him for a moment, She opened her mouth as if to say something important, but merely smiled and said that he was welcome. He watched appreciatively as she tenderly eased some of his discomfort. "I really do love you, Elizabeth Marie," he declared unexpectedly. "I think you're delirious," she stated, and withdrew a knife from her belt. "I brought you some clothes." The knife severed the ropes cleanly, and she caught him as he came down. His weight was too much for her, though, and she stumbled. He took advantage of this, tripping her. As they tumbled to the ground, he tried to pin her with what remaining strength he had, which wasn't much. Suddenly he felt something cold and hard pressing below where his belt would have normally hung. He quickly loosened his grip. "Did you think a couple of lovey-dovey words would make me lower my guard, Pax? I know how much you hate me now," she snarled, clutching the knife tightly. "There was always hoping, Lizzie." "I always detested it when you called me Lizzie." She kneed his groin with considerable oomph and rolled him off her. While he slouched there recovering, she stood up, retrieved the clothes she'd brought, and threw them at him. "I seem to have forgotten boots. Sorry." Mounting her horse, she tossed him the leather flask. "Good luck, Pax." "So, you're leaving me again, are you?" "You're not surprised?" "No." Painfully he got to his feet, blistered and sore from her assault and the time hanging on the tree. The noise of a gunshot rang through the air. Startled, Elizabeth turned her horse sharply, and after a concerned glance at Paxton, spurred her to a canter. As Velvet sped in the direction the shot had come from, Elizabeth took out her gun and held it ready. She couldn't yet see who'd fired the shot because of the desert dunes and brush, but she was sure the perpetrator was no friend. Paxton watched her ride off, grabbed the clothes, rushed behind the large oak, and hurried to put them on. Periodically, he peered around the tree to see if anyone was coming. To be caught in such a compromising, not to mention embarrassing position could be dangerous. Elizabeth saw the rider clearly, and her stomach flipped in despair. She had hoped she would never see him again. "Miss Eliza, or should I call you Mrs. Rain? You sure are pretty." He sat confidently on his horse, leering at her. Saying nothing, she eyed the large rattler he'd evidently just shot. Her heart pounded as she thanked the Lord that Willie was not too bright. He'd obviously not considered that his decision to shoot the snake would alert her to his presence and give her time to react. "Dinner." He licked his thin lips and then dismounted to pick up the dead snake. "What you doing here? Mr. Stanton told you to stay away." "I'm just burying my past, Willie," she replied coolly. "So he's dead, then?" "Must have just died. The vultures were tearing at his flesh, but his blood was still warm." "Tearing at his flesh, were they?" Willie smiled viciously, envisioning the gruesome spectacle with conspicuous delight. "Good. Mr. Stanton will like hearing that. But he won't be none too pleased to hear you came here, and He paused and looked her up and down disdainfully. "Dressed like that, too!" "Mr. Stanton doesn't have to know," she retorted, tightening the grip on her gun. Ignoring her statement and its implications, he conjectured, "Guess now Mr. Rain has passed on, sadly." Again that sardonic grin. "Stanton's free to marry ya." "You guess so, huh?" she murmured, glancing back toward the oak. Noticing her momentary distraction, Willie was suddenly filled with suspicion, doubting Elizabeth had really buried her husband. Indeed, it was more likely she'd freed him and was now anxious for his escape. His eyes narrowed. She was never supposed to find out about their plans to crucify Paxton. It was sheer luck that Stanton had noticed her listening in. Stanton, not trusting her, had promptly set Willie as Elizabeth's watchdog, and he'd done a first-rate job for at least 3 days. Today, however, he dozed off because he'd drunk too much the night before. About an hour later, he discovered Elizabeth had disappeared. It didn't take him long to figure out where, only about a quarter of an hour. While she was preoccupied, Willie moved toward her. He could not let Elizabeth or her husband escape. Faster than she could react, he seized her leg and yanked her from the saddle. Kneeling down on one knee, he grabbed her torso and hoisted her against his upright knee, placing his sweaty palm against her throat. "You wouldn't be lyin' to me now, would you, darlin'?" She gasped for air and fished around for her gun, which had been knocked out of her grasp when she hit the ground. Unable to locate it, she grabbed a fistful of dirt and threw it backward, hoping to get some in Willie's eyes. It worked, but not to her advantage. He only tightened his grip around her throat, and she soon blacked out. Willie released his hold on Elizabeth and looked toward the oak, hoping to catch some glimpse of movement or a hint of his quarry. Paxton, however, had already vacated that particular tree in search of both his wife and the origin of the gunshot. From behind a western juniper tree, he quietly watched as an unconscious Elizabeth was thrown over her horse and secured to the saddle. Willie, still holding Velvet's reins, mounted his own horse and rode toward the oak. Paxton deftly stole to a location where he could monitor Willie without fear of discovery. Fiddling lazily with a twig, he observed, as Willie, noticing a freshly dug grave, Elizabeth's red herring, decided a more thorough search of the area wasn't worthwhile. The henchman turned in his saddle, scanning the vicinity once more before he rode off with Elizabeth and her horse in tow. Paxton sighed and glanced at the oak with the severed ropes that had almost meant his death. Exhaustion surfaced, and he knew he'd narrowly escaped with his life. Lizzie had brought him clothing which camouflaged him with the terrain. That fact, supplemented with his own skill, had kept him concealed from Willie's probing eyes. She'd also had the foresight to bring him some cooled chicken broth, which naturally filled his belly without making him sick. Ever since he'd met Elizabeth, she'd always been intelligent and very adept at caring for herself and others. In that instant, he knew what had happened hadn't been her fault. Despite what he'd been told, it was evident she hadn't been involved in the plot to murder him. Why else would she have rescued him? A nagging in his brain rationalized otherwise. She could have planned his annihilation and felt guilty or regretful afterwards, and thus sought to right her wrong by freeing him. But if she were in control, or even a willing pawn of Stanton, then why did Willie have to knock her out to take her back? Why was Willie there in the first place? Many similar questions buzzed in his mind. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that deep down he knew Elizabeth could always be trusted to do what she thought was best. A slight gust of wind whipped up a miniature whirlwind of dirt and caused Paxton to look up. A storm was moving in. Finishing the broth in one gulp, he pocketed the flask and stood up. If only once more he had to see her again, even if it was an extremely foolish risk. He knew what he had to do. Paxton Rain searched where Elizabeth had lost her gun and located it partially buried in some bracken. He uncocked it and checked to see if it was properly loaded, which it was. He chuckled. Elizabeth sure knew her guns and how to use them. His bare feet were bleeding from the rough underbrush. Shrugging, he pocketed the gun and began walking toward Mayor Maxwell Stanton's house.